Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night was the piece that I chose for my investigative object proposal, as it is the painting that I have personal history with. This painting is my twin brother's favorite painting, and as a result, my mom purchased it, and it is still one of the few pieces of art that hangs in my home. Despite this painting hanging in our home for many years, I have never truly understood the message behind this work. So, for my investigative project, I wanted to discover the message that Van Gogh was attempting to portray through his use of materials, style, symbolism, and historical context. After extensive research, I have come to believe that Van Gogh was attempting to portray the beginning of his transition from life on earth to the beginning of his life in heaven. The very first thing that I discovered on this journey is that there is no giant mountain in Starry Night, but that is a pair of cypress trees. I am colorblind, so I thought maybe that there was a green in the image that I was missing, which was true, however. Upon discussion with my family, I was not the only one who thought that this was a mountain, as everyone in my family began to feverishly Google this upon my revelation. This was the first sign of how far I had to go to understanding this masterpiece. The first work that I wanted to compare this artwork was The Birth of Venus. Although the piece was vastly different messages that you could possibly make a case for comparing the two. I want to specifically look at the materials used in these two pieces. Venus is made with an egg tempera, while Starry Night is made with oil paints on canvas. I have always found the Venus painting to be one great beauty, and I was curious as to why they used oil and canvas over a medium like egg tempera. Egg tempera is used to stay vibrant and hold color over a very long period of time. However, despite the quickness in drying and need to apply many layers, as this takes time in of itself. Oil paints have a slow drying time, which allow for edits after initial stroke. However, the major factor I found is that egg tempera is best on hard surfaces. In other words, walls and canvases that are not paper. Whereas oil paints, with their thickness and flexibility, do not flake when applied on malleable surfaces. As Van Gogh was at St. Remy's at this time, it is unlikely they had any hard surfaces to paint on. Another reason I believe that Van Gogh went with oil paintings over something like egg tempera is the appearance of texture. With oil, it gives the artist the ability to make visible brush strokes that jump off the canvas and give the work texture. Whereas with Venus, you get this idealized image with vibrant colors. This lack of visible texture gives me the impression that it looks like something that would come out of one's imagination. As you can see the texture inside the image, but the actual object itself lacks that texture. Whereas Starry Night, you can visibly see the texture as if you could touch it. And of course, no one can actually do this, but you could feel the texture of the paint, which gives me an earthy feel, as it is an object that belongs in reality instead of the imagination. This gives the sense that Van Gogh is still on Earth and has yet to move on to the afterlife. Being on the topic of physical texture and brushstrokes, a common mistake that I see many others make without comprehensive knowledge in art is originally thought that Starry Night was an impressionist style of artwork, when in reality Starry Night is actually post-impressionist, whereas Claude Monet's work Impression Sunrise is an impressionist painting. Due to the common misconception, I want to dive into the differences between the two styles and how it's important of the meaning behind Van Gogh's work. Impressionism focuses on the painting's landscape and scenes of modern life, just like the Impressionist sunrise. You can see the steamboat in the modern day at this time, a city in the background. Impressionism is known for its unique standout brushstrokes that you can see. However, when the two are different from each other, is in their messaging. Post-Impressionists favor emphasis on symbolic content over the realistic approach of Impressionism. As you can see in the Impressionist sunrise, it is the picture of something that the artist was directly recreating. In this scene is one you can see in the real world, whereas Starry Night is an exaggeration of nature. These exaggerations are used to emphasize the symbolism that Van Gogh is using in the 12 large stars, the moon, the two cypress trees, that is uncommon for cypress trees to grow together like that, and also the movement of the trees between the stars. By using a post-impressionist style, emphasizing important imagery in the work of Van Gogh, he's able to better emphasize this message behind his work. Van Gogh's Starry Night is filled with symbolism, as was common characteristic of post-impressionist paintings. Some of the key features include the symbolism of stars, moon, church, and trees. There are a total of 12 stars in the sky, which many believe is a reference of God and his disciples. Although at the time of Van Gogh's painted Starry Night, the moon was not in crescent form, as he chose to create it as a crescent. A crescent moon is transitionary phase of the moon cycles as it begins the beginning and end. Similarly, Van Gogh, I believe, sees himself as in a transitionary phase between the ending of his current life and to the beginning of the afterlife. Van Gogh also included the church below the cypress trees in his painting as an obvious reference to his faith and his belief in heaven. Another interesting act of Van Gogh is it takes the entire image moves to the right with an exception of the cypress tree, which features vertical brush strokes. These strokes reach towards the stars, which I believe is represent God and to show that Van Gogh sees himself getting closer to heaven. Cypress trees were featured in other works by Van Gogh during this time period. In A wheat field with cypresses, you can see that Van Gogh paints a similar looking pair of cypress trees. Once again, these cypresses come in a pair, which is something not often seen in nature. Due to the strong association of death and mourning that the cypress tree has, you can tell that the death was definitely on Van Gogh's mind. However, I believe that this pairing of cypress trees has a more complex meaning in his work. The first interesting note is notice how in both works the movement of the brushstrokes are vertical. This is especially noticeable in Starry Night, where most of the entire painting the brushstrokes fall horizontally, like mentioned earlier, except the cypress trees. These trees are making an obvious ascent towards the sky, and the heavens, despite being rooted in the earth, is where I believe Van Gogh is acknowledging that he is currently alive on earth, but his life is like the tall cypress tree has almost finished making its ascent to heaven. Another interesting aspect of Van Gogh's cypress trees are their pairings. In both of these works, the trees are paired together, with one tree being noticeably taller than the other. As I mentioned earlier, if we look at the cypress trees as climbing towards heaven, I would argue that the two are both present in Van Gogh's life. The taller of the trees represents his coming ascent to heaven and how with every day that passes it grows closer and closer. Whereas the smaller of the trees is part of the larger tree that would be left behind, as in Van Gogh's achievements, work, and legacy. These three things are all part of Van Gogh's life that will continue to remain and grow even after Van Gogh himself has moved on to his best life in the sky. Van Gogh to this day is one of the most famous painters in all of history, and and that tree that was left behind is still growing as people continue to research his life, purchase and admire the artwork that he has left behind. The smaller tree will never surpass the taller tree, as we will never know every detail of Van Gogh's life, but it will continue to grow little by little, so long as Van Gogh remains relevant in history. Let's now take a step back and look into the historical context of the painting. Van Gogh voluntarily entered the asylum at St. Remy's in May 1889. Henry Gusteau, in a study of the artist's life and medical history published in 1956, identified Van Gogh's major illnesses during the last 2 years of his life, with the form of epilepsy. This illness caused Van Gogh to experience hallucinations and also caused him to suffer from bipolar disorder. During the full year he remained there, he experienced three psychotic relapses with prominent amnesia. These episodes were very painful and hard on Van Gogh both physically and emotionally. While at St. Remy, he produced some 300 works of art, among them Starry Night, which was painted in June 1889. Bloomer, author of The Illness of St. Vincent van Gogh, argues with this painting, Van Gogh may have recreated his memory of a particularly haunting and perhaps recurrent vision of apocalyptic dimension experienced during a twilight state. The vision is set in the familiar surroundings of the soft hills and flame-shaped cypresses of Provence, and yet the village with its church spire is reminiscent of Van Gogh's native Brabant. He is using elements from his early life and mixing them into his current state. In essence, he was reminiscing about his life. Due to the failing health and pain Van Gogh was in, uh, I believe he wouldn't last much longer on Earth. Only a year later, in July 1890, he committed suicide. In conclusion, Van Gogh's Starry Night is a masterpiece that has long stood the test of time and is still relevant to this day. After thoroughly researching this mysterious painting, I have been able to discover my own meaning and message behind the work. It is my belief that his work is a transition between Van Gogh's life on earth to his next life in heaven. Through the use of oil and canvas, post Impressionist style in religious symbolism, Van Gogh is able to express a fine line between life and death in his journey as he approaches the end of life and the beginning of his death.